Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast is your one-stop shop for fantasy football news and advice. Can't decide on who to draft on the first round? Going gaga on how to line up your team. Got you covered. Traditional League, Dynasty League, PPR League, IDP League, even Daily Fantasy Football League. Join us as we break down all the questions of fantasy football. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
All right, and welcome to another edition of the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Kenneth Gruenfelder, and we got a great show for you today. So first, I'm going to be doing a segment called Produce or Reduce. So I'm going to be taking 10 players that had really good 2020 seasons in fantasy, and I'm going to determine whether or not they're going to produce and replicate that production from 2020, or they're going to reduce and take a step back in terms of production. Then I'm going to do an evaluation of each division in the NFL and pick out players that I think you're going to want to get on your fantasy teams. Now, I know I did a ranking a few shows back where I did the top 10 teams where you want to draft your players from and the top 10 teams where you don't want to draft any players from, but I think that, there are some individual players on every team that you could definitely, pick out and choose and say to yourself, well, the team may not be very good, but, I might want to draft this player because, they don't have to necessarily have the parts around them to be successful. Then for the third segment, we're going to do the top 10 kickers in fantasy. And then, of course, we will do another edition of Draft or Pass with 10 tight ends that I have picked out, and I will determine whether I would draft them or I would pass on them. So, yeah, let's get right into it. So, I have 10 players here that I'm going to evaluate and predict whether or not they're going to replicate what they did in 2020. So, produce, or are they going to take a little bit of a step back and reduce in terms of what their 2020 stats were. So the first player that I have here is Aaron Rodgers, the quarterback of the Green Bay Packers, who won MVP in 2020, had over 4,000 yards passing, 48 touchdowns to 5 interceptions, a QB rating of 121, and in terms of fantasy points, had 382 fantasy points. Now, wasn't his career high. This was actually the second most fantasy points he's had in a single season for his career, if I'm doing the math correctly, and I am. And his best fantasy season came in 2011 when he played 15 games and had 397. And this is in terms of standard leagues. But in 2020, he was great. He was really spectacular. He was the Aaron Rodgers that we're accustomed to seeing year in and year out. And some of the notable games that he had, 29 points against the Falcons, had 27 against the Texans, 28 against the 49ers. He had 30 against the Lions in Week 14, 25 against the Titans in Week 16, had 26 against the Bears in Week 17, had 30 points in Week 1 against the Vikings. So he was amazing. Now, do I think he's going to get 382 again? Or do I think he's going to take a little bit of a step back? I'm going to say his production is going to be reduced. I think he's still going to have a productive season, but I think 382 is a large number. And I think, depending on what the Packers do in the draft, because they really didn't address the wide receiver position in free agency, I think Devin Funchess is supposed to come back because they did sign him in the offseason, last offseason. and I think he's still under contract with the Packers. I'm not 100% sure on that, but I think outside of Devontae Adams, the Packers do need another wide receiver. So I think Aaron Rodgers is going to be productive, but I think in terms of fantasy, I think his numbers are going to dip a little bit. I don't think completely. I don't think he's going to fall off a cliff. I mean, because when you look at 2019, he got 278. 278 to 382 in 2020. That's a huge jump. But I think in terms of his production in fantasy, it's going to take a little bit of a step back. But I still anticipate he's going to be a QB1 across the board. He's definitely a must-have, a must-draft. But I think in terms of his total points, I think his point total is going to be reduced. All right, so the next player that I have on this list is the running back for the Tennessee Titans, Derrick Henry. He will be entering his 6th season in the NFL, was RB3 in 2020. He was the most recent running back to eclipse 2,000 yards rushing in a season since Adrian Peterson did that back in 2012. And yeah, he really has improved every season statistically. Jumped from 276 in 2019 to 314 in 2020. Now, do I think he's going to produce and replicate those numbers, or do I think he's going to take a little bit of a step back? I think, like Aaron Rodgers, he's still going to be very productive in fantasy, but in terms of if he's going to produce in terms of replicating those exact numbers in 2020, I think I'm kind of more on the reduced side, because I think the playoff game against the Ravens, that kind of, I think changed, I think that opened up a lot of people's eyes around the league, and I think a lot of teams are going to replicate what the Ravens did in the playoffs and are going to try and, basically copy the Ravens game plan, whenever teams go up against Derrick Henry. And I think because of that, Derrick Henry's production is going to take a little bit of a step back. Now, I think he's still going to be productive, but I think his numbers are going to be reduced a little bit to a certain extent. But I want to emphasize, I think, he's going to be a first-round pick. You definitely should draft him. But in terms of his numbers from 2020 and what they might be in 2021, I think you're going to see a reduction in terms of productivity. All right, and the next player on this list, I have Travis Kelce, the tight end of the Kansas City Chiefs. In 2020, had by far his best statistical season in terms of fantasy. And, outside of fantasy, had 1,400 yards, 11 touchdowns, had 207 fantasy points, and this is in terms of standard leagues. And this is what I'm basically going to be going off of in standard leagues. Now, I think Travis Kelce can have an even better season, honestly. I think that, he plays in an offense that, it's basically just a pass-happy offense, and he's one of the main guys on that offense. And, definitely had his best season by far in the NFL. And you know what? I think he can do better than what he did, this past season. He played in 15 games. They sat most of their starters in week 17 when they played the Chargers. I think Travis Kelce can definitely replicate these numbers and do even better than what he did in 2020. So I'm going to say Travis Kelce is going to produce, and I also think that a lot of people are going to be drafting him in the first round. Even in PPR, I think he's somebody that, you might want to take him over some receivers in some of your fantasy leagues, because, he basically is like a wide receiver because of the amount of targets he gets. And, he's Patrick Mahomes' security blanket, so that definitely helps. So Travis Kelce, I think, is going to produce and have even better numbers than he did in 2020. All right, so the next player I have on this list is Josh Allen, the quarterback of the Buffalo Bills. Coming off of his best season, has improved every single year since he's entered the league. Back in 2018, had 37 touchdowns. In 2020, had 395 in terms of fantasy points, averaged 24 points per game in fantasy, and again, this is in terms of standard numbers. I think Josh Allen can do even better. I really do. He threw 37. I think he could get 40 this year. I think what the Bills have to do is address the running game, because right now they really don't have any running backs that, really you can rely upon. They really, in the playoffs, they had to sign Devontae Freeman, because I think Zach Morris got injured. and Devin Singletary really hasn't lived up to his expectations yet. So they got to improve the running game, but I just think that, he's going to continue to improve, and I think he could throw 40-plus touchdowns in 2021. He made big strides from his rookie season up until now, and I think he's only going to get better because the Bills do have a good system, and, he's really benefited from that. Bringing in Stephon Diggs was huge, and he really benefited from that because, he was good his sophomore year, but, he didn't have like a true number one wide receiver. Cole Beasley and John Brown were nice pieces, but they really didn't have like that number one wide receiver that you typically need when you're a quarterback. And, with Stephon Diggs, he greatly improved, and I think he could throw 40-plus touchdowns this year. I think the Bills are going to be really good again this year, and Josh Allen, he might be the first QB taken off the board in fantasy. So I think he's going to produce. I think he's going to have even better numbers, which, like I said, his total points that he had was 395, which is a lot. And, you throw 40-plus touchdowns, that's definitely going to get, that number's going to increase. So I say that Josh Allen is going to produce and have better numbers than he did in 2020. Okay, the next player on this list, I have the wide receiver for the Green Bay Packers, Davante Adams, coming off of his best season where he had 18 receiving touchdowns in 14 games, had 1,300 yards receiving, averaged 17 fantasy points per game, and had 243 total points, and that's in terms of standard numbers. And, some of his best games, week 1 against the Vikings, 27 points, 31 against the Texans in week 7, had 23 against the Vikings in week 8, 23 against the Niners in week 9, had 24 against the Eagles in week 13, had 32 against the Titans in week 16. So I think, again, he's going to be the number one wide receiver taken off the board. It's possible that, some people might take maybe Stephon Diggs. Maybe Stephon Diggs kind of, takes over and maybe could be the number one wide receiver taken, possibly. Not saying that's going to happen, but I think Stephon Diggs' draft stock's kind of increased a little bit, since, the breakout year that he had. But in terms of Davante Adams, I think he'll be the first wide receiver taken off the board. Now, do I think that he's going to replicate these numbers and, basically have the same season that he did in 2020? I don't think so. I think that he's still going to be productive. He's going to have a really great season, but I think that, this is kind of one of the seasons it's like that he had in 2020. It's hard to have those same exact numbers. I mean, 18 touchdown receptions. I mean, that's, that's going to be tough to replicate. Now, I think he's going to still be very productive, still have a great season, but I don't think he's going to do what he did in 2020. So I'm going to say his production is going to be reduced, but once again, should be the first wide receiver taken off the board in your fantasy drafts, and he's going to have a productive season. All right, the next player I have on this list is the quarterback of the Arizona Cardinals, Kyler Murray, coming off a season where he threw 26 touchdowns to 12 interceptions, had 378 fantasy points, had 819 rushing yards, and 11 touchdowns. I think this is a guy that's going to put up even better numbers than he did in 2020. I think that he's going to have more touchdowns this year in 2021. I think in terms of rushing yards, probably going to take a little bit of a step back. I think that and the rushing touchdowns maybe might, come back down to earth a little bit. I think he's still going to be effective in the running game. But I think in terms of his overall numbers, I think that, I think he could definitely pass for over 4,000 yards. I think he could throw for 30-plus touchdowns this year. And because of that, I'm going to say he's going to be on the produced side. I think he's going to eclipse the 378-point total, and I think he's going to be even better this season. I really do. And some of the best games that he had in 2020, he had 28 points against Dallas in Week 6. Week 7, he had 37 against the Seahawks. In Week 9, he had 37 against the Dolphins, had 29 against the Bills, had 33 against the Eagles in Week 15. He did have a couple of duds. Week 12 against the Patriots was one where he only had 7. But I think that he's going to be poised to have a really good season and throw for 30-plus touchdowns. I really do. So Kyler Murray, another player that I have on this list. All right, and the next player on this list, we actually have Kyler Murray's teammate, the wide receiver for the Cardinals, DeAndre Hopkins, coming off his first season with the Arizona Cardinals, where he had 1,400 yards and 6 touchdowns and had 172 fantasy points. I think he's going to produce. I think this one's kind of an easy one. This isn't like, well, I think this, or, maybe he's not going to get quite those numbers. No, I think this is, he's going to have a bounce-back season. I think he's going to have more touchdowns. Did have a lot of receiving yards, but I think in terms of touchdown receptions, I think he's going to be vastly improved. I think now that he's in his second season in the system here in Arizona, I think that he's going to have more touchdowns, and I think because of that, he's going to have more fantasy points. I really do. So I think DeAndre Hopkins is going to produce. He did have a couple of games where you were wondering, what happened. Against the Panthers, he only had 4. Against the Dolphins, he only had 3 points. In Week 16, he only had 4 points. I think you're not going to see a lot of that next season. I think he's going to be healthy. Kyler Murray's going to be healthy. They're going to have a much better connection, more chemistry going into the season than they did in 2020. And because of that, I think DeAndre Hopkins is going to produce and have an even better season than he did in 2020. And with that, the next player I have here is Aaron Jones, the running back for the Green Bay Packers, entering his 5th season in the NFL, coming off of a season where he had 1,100 yards, rushing, 9 touchdowns, 355 receiving yards, 2 receiving touchdowns, at 211 fantasy points in terms of standard leagues. Now, in 2019, he had 16 rushing touchdowns, had 3 receiving touchdowns, had 265 fantasy points, averaged 16 points per game back in 2019. In 2020, he averaged 15. I think the numbers are going to continue to dip for Aaron Jones because I think that, it's going to be hard to replicate what he did in 2019. And, you can kind of see in 2020, he was kind of on the decline in terms of touchdowns. I think that he's not going to eclipse what he did in 2019. I don't think he's going to eclipse what he did in 2020 either. I think he's one of those guys that, you got to be a little bit careful with going into this season. I think he's still going to be productive, but I do not think that he's going to produce at the level that he has the last 2 years, considering I think Green Bay's offensive line is going to be taking a step back. And I think A.J. Dillon is going to take some of the carries away from Aaron Jones because A.J. Dillon, when he played, was pretty effective on the ground. And I think that Aaron Jones and A.J. Dillon have the potential to be a deadly 1-2 punch as a running back duo for the Green Bay Packers. But I just think that, you look at some of the games that Aaron Jones had, 41 points against the Lions in Week 2, and then didn't really get anywhere close to that at all in 2020. He had 20 points against Philadelphia in Week 13, and that was in large part because he had that huge run at the end of the game. Also had 21 points against the Panthers in Week 15, but other than that, failed to reach 20 points in any other games, 20 points or more in any other games. So I think, although Aaron Jones, I believe, is going to produce, I don't think that he's going to replicate the numbers that he has had over the last couple seasons, so I'm going to say he's going to reduce. So the next player on this list, I have the wide receiver for the Minnesota Vikings, Justin Jefferson, coming off of a rookie season where he had 1,400 yards receiving, 7 touchdowns, and his fantasy points in terms of standard leagues at 186, averaged 11.6 points per game. Some of the best games that he had, 23 against the Titans in Week 3, 30 points against the Falcons in Week 6, had 18 points against the Jaguars in Week 13. I think he's going to produce. He really, filled in the void for this offense, since the Vikings traded Stephon Diggs. And I think he's only going to get better. I really do. He's got a nice... it helps when he has Adam Thielen opposite of him. And listen, I mean, he's 22 years old, going into his second season. He was wide receiver 7. I think he's going to be. I think he's going to improve, and he's going to get even better. Kirk Cousins can be inconsistent, but I think that, now going into your sophomore season, expectations are going to be a lot higher, and I think his draft stock is going to skyrocket coming up. I think that a lot of people are going to want to get him on their team when, everybody starts drafting in a couple of months. So I'm going to say Justin Jefferson is going to produce in 2021. His numbers are going to be even better than they were in 2020. All right, and for the last player on this list, we have the wide receiver for the Buffalo Bills, Stephon Diggs, coming off of a season where he had 1,500 yards receiving, 166 targets, and 127 receptions, 8 touchdowns, had 201 fantasy points. Some of his best games, he had 32 points Week 16 against the Patriots, 21 points against the Dolphins in Week 2. He was pretty consistent. And, I don't think he's going to get 1,500 yards receiving in 2021. But I do think his numbers are going to be even better. I think he's going to have more touchdown passes. I think he has the potential to get into, double digits in terms of touchdown receptions. I don't know if he's going to get 166 targets because now the Bills, they bring in Emmanuel Sanders. Gabriel Davis, I think, is going to take on a bigger role for this team. And they still got Cole Beasley as well. So I think there's going to be more of a target share amongst the receivers. But I do think he's going to have more than 200 points this year. And I think he has the potential to be a top 3 wide receiver in fantasy in 2021. So I'm going to say Stephon Diggs is going to produce. And with that concludes this first segment of the show. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we are going to do an evaluation of the fantasy players that I think you should take amongst the players in the NFC East. So stick around. We'll be right back here on the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines. They got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Alright, and we're back here on the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. So for the second segment, we're going to do an evaluation of fantasy players in the NFC East and what fantasy players you're going to want to get on your fantasy teams. Now, this is something we're going to do for the next several shows. We're just going to go through each division in the NFL, and we're going to go through certain players that you're going to want to get for your fantasy team. So for today, I wanted to start out with the NFC East. So we'll go through all of the NFC divisions, and then we'll move on to the AFC in the coming weeks. So let's start off with the NFC East. So players that you're going to want to get on your fantasy team. So first, let's go with the division winner from 2020, and that is the Washington football team. I highlighted 4 players that I think you're definitely going to want to consider getting on your fantasy teams. Now, I know, like I said early on in the show, that a couple weeks ago, or a week or two ago, whatever it was, I did the top 10 teams that have fantasy players that you're going to want to get on your team. And then I had the top 10 teams where I said you're kind of going to want to avoid taking players from or don't really have that many fantasy players that you'd want to get on your team. But I know that for really every team, there is at least one or two players that, you could want to consider drafting. So let's start off with the Washington football team for the NFC East, considering that they won the division. So I'm kind of going to go in order in which the team finished, I guess, So looking at the Washington football team, like I said, there's 4 players here that I highlighted that I think are fantasy worthy, and one of them is one of the players that they acquired this offseason, and that is Curtis Samuel, the wide receiver who previously was on the Carolina Panthers. I think he's a guy you're definitely going to want to get. He was very solid in 2020. I think he was kind of underrated in fantasy last year. Had 851 receiving yards, 3 touchdowns, had 200 yards rushing and 2 touchdowns, had 135 fantasy points. That was clearly his best stat-wise, and I think that he's going to have an even better season. Some of his notable games that, obviously the numbers don't really jump out at you, but against Kansas City, he had 700, had 17 points in that game, had 17 points the week before against Atlanta, had 15 points against Washington in Week 16, and he actually had, in terms of rushing yards, they like to use him a lot in the running game because of the fact that Christian McCaffrey was out. They kind of moved Curtis Samuel around, and he was able to produce. And obviously, he didn't put up big, gigantic numbers, but he was definitely productive, and he's somebody that you definitely would consider maybe getting as a wide receiver too, or definitely a flex option. I think he's somebody that typically, you'll probably get in the later rounds because, again, there's better options out there. But, he's definitely a guy on this football team that I think is going to produce and somebody that you want to consider drafting in your fantasy leagues. So next is a guy that I've talked about before once on the show, and that is Antonio Gibson, the running back for Washington. Had a pretty good stretch where, he was maybe considered number 1 running back, especially in the 2 matchups against Dallas. He had 18 points in the first game, and then he had his breakout game where he had 20 carries for 115 yards and 3 touchdowns, had 31 points in that game, but then dealt with injuries the final 3 games of the season, so he really wasn't able to produce at the level that he did on Thanksgiving. But I think he's another guy that you're going to want to consider drafting. Had 116 points total in fantasy, really came on strong as the season progressed, and I think he's another guy that I think has the potential to be a number 2 running back. Definitely when it comes to dynasty leagues, you're definitely going to want to maybe consider him to get, because he's only 22, and I think that Washington's going to want to run the football. We don't really know what they're going to do at quarterback. Ryan Fitzpatrick is there. They re-signed Taylor Heineke. Who knows what they're going to do with the draft coming up? But I think he's definitely somebody you're going to want to consider getting. I think he's going to be very productive at the running back spot. Then, of course, I have Terry McLaurin here, the wide receiver for Washington. Only 25 years old, is going to be entering his 3rd season in the NFL, and really had almost the same amount of points in both seasons in the NFL, the 2 seasons that he has played in. Had 133 points in 2019 and had 136 in 2020, and this is going off of standard numbers. Some of his best games, he had 18 points in Week 2 against Arizona, had 17 points against the Giants in Week 9, but really he didn't have any games where he had above 20, and really had some duds here. He had 1 point against Pittsburgh, he had 2 against San Francisco, he had 2 against the Rams. So some games he really didn't do that good, but I think he's still somebody that you want to consider getting. I think he's a strong number 2 wide receiver if you got him, and possibly could be a wide receiver 1, possibly. Not really. I mean, I'm just considering that because he is Washington's number 1, but judging by these numbers, really doesn't really have the body of work in terms of fantasy numbers to be a number 1 wide receiver in fantasy, but definitely could be a number 2 and definitely could be a flex. I think more so wide receiver 2 for you. But you know what? With Ryan Fitzpatrick, maybe his numbers improve because Ryan Fitzpatrick is a gunslinger and he likes to throw that ball around. And, you got Terry McLaurin, you got Curtis Samuel, so I think that McLaurin, I think, will benefit if Fitzpatrick does start, because Fitzpatrick, like I said, he likes to throw the football around. So I think Terry McLaurin is another player from Washington that you definitely want to get. And, of course, the tight end for Washington, Logan Thomas. I think he's going to be a productive tight end in fantasy. Had a breakout year in 2020. Had 104 points there in 2020. Had 6 touchdowns, 670 receiving yards. Was targeted 110 times. And, yeah, he had a breakout season. Was pretty consistent towards the end of the year. He had 15 points against Pittsburgh. Yeah, he was pretty good down the stretch. I think he has the potential to be a top tight end in fantasy, and I think he's definitely somebody you're going to want to consider when you're drafting in your fantasy leagues, considering that the tight end spot can be pretty thin. So Logan Thomas, another player from Washington that I think you can consider drafting. And yeah, I think that's actually it with Washington. So Curtis Samuel, Terry McLaurin, Antonio Gibson, Logan Thomas, I think those are the 4 strong players that I think you would want to draft if they fall to you and you feel comfortable taking them in your drafts. So next we're going to talk about the New York Giants. So there's several players that I think you're going to want to draft when talking about the New York Giants. I think that, of course, the main guy would be Saquon Barkley. I think he's going to have a bounce-back season after, essentially only playing 2 games because of the ACL injury that he got in Week 2. And I think he's going to be a number 1 running back in a lot of leagues. And, and rightly so, because, he's a guy that, the Giants are going to want to run the football. I think that's something that they really, kind of emphasized even after Saquon got hurt. Running the ball with Wayne Gallman and Devontae Freeman, Alfred Morris. The Giants wanted to run the football. And I think that, the Giants, with the draft coming up, I think they're going to want to improve the offensive line. And I think Saquon's going to benefit from that. Now, I'm kind of, a little bit on the fence with drafting him because, I'm just kind of nervous and skeptical, of him coming back from the injury and how is he going to be, after the injury. I mean, I think that he's going to get a lot of carries. And I think that, he's going to have a good season. I think, if he stays healthy, he's going to have a lot of touchdowns because the Giants, are definitely going to give him the ball at the goal line. I think that, the one thing that concerns me, like I said, is the injury. I think the injury concerns me. Hasn't played a full season outside of his rookie year. Was hurt in 2019 as well. Missed a couple games there. So I don't really know. But I think he's going to be a first-round pick. Has a potential to even drop out of the first round, I think, just because of the injuries. And, the Giants offensively, they kind of struggled last year. So a lot of those things kind of, lead me to kind of, want to stay away from Saquon. But you know what? I think you got to draft him. He's somebody that's not going to, he's not going to fall out of the second round. I think the latest you would take him is probably the second round. But I think he's probably going to be a first-round pick. I might have a top 5 pick this year in the main league that I do. And if Saquon is there and, I'm picking at 5, because 5's kind of like no man's land when it comes to fantasy drafts, it's going to be hard to not take him. But, I might look at other positions. I might look at maybe what receivers are there at that point. But overall, I think Saquon, you got to draft him. If he's like the best player available, I think that you have to take him. So he's one fantasy player. Another player, I'd probably say Kenny Golladay. I think that the one thing that concerns me with him and concerns me with other guys that I think are draft worthy, and that's Sterling Shepard and Darius Slayton. The things that concern me with them is the quarterback position for the Giants. Daniel Jones, he only threw 11 touchdowns last year. He turned the ball over 10 times, which he did kind of fix his turnover problem to some extent. But, I'm kind of nervous about Daniel Jones because he did decline, after throwing 20-plus touchdowns his rookie season. and I don't know what happened to him. So Daniel Jones is a big year for him, but I think you would still have to draft Golladay. I think Golladay could be possibly a number 1 wide receiver, but if not number 1, definitely a number 2, because Kenny Golladay did have a lot of touchdowns in 2019. I think he had like 18, I want to say. I've said it before on the show, but it slips my mind at the moment. But, he was productive with Matthew Stafford. Hopefully he can develop some chemistry with Daniel Jones, and I think Kenny Golladay is somebody, you probably would maybe want to get 3rd, 4th round maybe. Darius Slayton, he's going to be taken in later rounds, probably like the 7th or 8th round. Sterling Shepard, I think, is probably going to be taken last out of that group. But they're good bench players, I think. Darius Slayton, you could maybe start your flex. Shepard is definitely a guy you could draft, when guys on your team are on bye weeks. So, he's definitely somebody you could store away on your bench and be productive. So, those are probably the 4 guys that I would definitely take. I would avoid Evan Ingram. I just think, we've given him so many chances, and he really has not delivered. So I'd probably stay away from Evan Ingram. And Daniel Jones, if you're doing a 2 QB league like I do, you could maybe get him as your 3rd QB, but outside of that, I'd probably not take my chances on him. He could definitely be a waiver wire pickup, because if he does play well, you're definitely going to want to pick him up. Kyle Rudolph is a guy they also brought in. I think that, waiver wire pickup, because they're probably going to mostly use him in the red zone, but I don't know. So yeah, those are the players from the Giants that I'd probably take. Then moving on to the Cowboys, you got Dak, you got Zeke, CeeDee Lamb, Amari Cooper. I think those are the 4 guys that, are must drafts in fantasy. I think CeeDee Lamb has the potential to be a great number 2 in fantasy, and I think that would be a great flex option, depending on how deep, your wide receiver core is in fantasy. I think Zeke is going to bounce back this year. The offensive line hopefully is better and blocks better, and he doesn't fumble a lot. You got Dak coming back. I think Dak's going to put up good numbers like he always does in fantasy. When it comes to actually winning football games for him, a lot of his points, come in garbage time. We saw that in 2019. We saw that a little bit in 2020 before the injury. But you know what? You don't care. Garbage points or not, you'll take it in fantasy. I think it's going to take a little bit of time for Dak to get going, but I think that he's going to be productive. And I think that also Amari Cooper is going to benefit from Dak coming back as well, because, with Ben DiNucci and Andy Dalton and Garrett Gilbert, it was kind of an up and down season for Amari Cooper, and he does have those games where he gets shut down and he doesn't do anything, and you're like, what happened? But I think Amari Cooper can be a definite number 2 wide receiver, possibly a number 1 with Dak coming back and playing a full season, because, since Amari Cooper has come to the Cowboys, he's been a very productive receiver, and I expect him to be very consistent throughout the year with Dak coming back. But yes, you do have to worry about those 1 or 2 games where he just, lays a goose head, because I'm pretty sure there was one where he had no points. And, he's going to be going up against James Bradbury twice a year, and he shut out Amari Cooper in the matchups when they played each other. So, that's a little concerning. But overall, I think, when you look at the Cowboys offense, they have the potential to be, top 10 this year. I really do. As much as I don't like the Cowboys because I am a Giant fan, I think the offense is going to be good. And the main thing is they got to focus on the offensive line. They got to make sure that the offensive line, stays healthy and protects Dak, because he's coming off of a major injury. And then finally, let's go to the team that is clearly the worst team in the NFC East, and that is the Philadelphia Eagles. So there's really not that many players on this team that, really stand out to me in terms of fantasy. They did lose a lot of key guys. Well, they really haven't been key guys the last couple of years for them. They did get rid of Alshon Jeffrey. They got rid of Deshaun Jackson. So they lost a lot of guys. And most likely Zach Ertz is probably going to be gone too. So the team's going to look different, and it's going to probably be even worse than what it was in 2020. So, there's really only 3 players that, I kind of keyed in on that, I think are worth fantasy consideration. The first one is the quarterback for the Eagles, is Jalen Hurts. So, he played in 15 games. I mean, he only started 4, but, where the games that he started in had 19 points against the Saints, had 37 against the Cardinals, had 18 against Dallas, and then had 16 against Washington. I mean, the best game that he had was by far against the Cardinals. He threw for 338 yards, 3 touchdowns. He was really good in that game. And I think that, over the course of a full season, I think that he could be productive and be a quality fantasy QB, typically more so for a 2 QB league as opposed to 1. I think he's more of like a guy that you'll kind of draft as your second QB because there are better options out there. But, I think he's worth consideration for drafting. But now the Eagles, they're talking about, QB competitions and all that, and it's really confusing what's going on in Philadelphia. But I think that Jalen Hurts most likely will be the starter, and I think if he is, he's going to be a quality fantasy player in 2021. And then another player would be Dallas Goedert, the tight end. Now, I think Dallas Goedert's going to be one of Jalen Hurts' main targets, and, did have a couple of good games. Week 1 against Washington had 101 yards receiving, 1 touchdown, had 16 points in that game, had 13 against Cleveland. In Week 11 with a touchdown, had a touchdown the following week against the Seahawks, had 13 points in that game. I think he could be a good tight end, especially, the tight end spot is really thin, and I think he could be one of those tight ends that you could get and, be productive. Because Zach Ertz, I don't think is going to be there anymore. I mean, I'm surprised he hasn't been moved. We'll see what happens with the draft coming up tomorrow. But I think Dallas Goedert, for the most part, is going to be one of those top targets for Jalen Hurts. So he's another player that I think you should kind of look into if, you don't have a tight end and, if there's not any appealing options out there. And then I guess Miles Sanders would be probably the last player that I would include on this list of players from the NFC East that you should draft. Didn't have, that great of a season. He was another guy that was injured a lot throughout the year. But, it did have some productive games, 25 points against the Saints. He had 21 against the Steelers in Week 5. But yeah, didn't have quite the season that he had back in 2019, but I think he's probably going to be the number 1 running back, and I think, for the most part, running backs can be valuable. So I would probably consider drafting Miles Sanders, if you need a running back. He's definitely not a number 1 running back. He could definitely be a solid number 2, and he could definitely be somebody you could put in your flex as well. But yeah, I think he's a number 1 back. I don't know if Boston Scott's going to affect, what he does. I think they have the potential to split carries, but I think Miles Sanders is a guy that, you're going to want to get on your fantasy team, even though, there's a lot of uncertainty. Because, if you look at his receiving stats in 2019, had 509 yards receiving and 3 touchdowns there. So, he's very effective in the passing game as well. And I think that's something that fantasy players need to take into consideration. So that is the list of players from the NFC East that I think are worth drafting. So with that, we're going to take another quick break. When we come back, we're going to do the top 10 kickers going into the 2021 NFL season and the ones that you're going to want to get on your fantasy team. So stick around. We'll be right back here on the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
All right, and we're back here on the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast for segment number 3 of the show. We're going to do the top 10 kickers entering the 2021 NFL season. So let's get right into it. So I'm going to be going in no particular order with this list, so here we go. First kicker is Rodrigo Blankenship for the Indianapolis Colts. He'll be entering his second season in the NFL, came out of Georgia. Was pretty productive for the Colts in his first season as their kicker, at 141 points in fantasy last season. Some of the notable games that he did really well in: 14 points against the Vikings, 10 against the Jets, had 13 against the Bears, had 14 against the Packers. That was an overtime win. He kicked the game-winning field goal in overtime. 14 against Vegas, the Vegas Raiders. And in terms of kickers, when it comes to fantasy, the numbers, are a lot different than as opposed to, if you're evaluating quarterbacks and running backs and tight ends and receivers and all that. When it comes to kickers, when you're getting double-digit points each week, that's really productive. And the Colts, I think, are going to be a top 10 offense this year with Carson Wentz coming in, having that top 10 offensive line, Jonathan Taylor being the lead back, and bringing back T.Y. Hilton. Michael Pittman hopefully is going to, step up and, be even better next season. So I think the Colts are going to be, scoring a lot of points. They're going to be a top 10 offense. And because of that, I think Rodrigo Blankenship is going to benefit from that. And because of that, I think he is going to be a top kicker going into the 2021 NFL season. All right, so the next kicker on this list, I have Ryan Succop, the kicker for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Has been in the league for a long time now, is going to be entering his 13th season in the NFL, and he had his career high, actually no, not his career high in fantasy points, never mind, by only 2. He had 138 this past season in 2020, but had a 140 for the Tennessee Titans back in 2017, so he was very close to eclipsing his career high. I just missed 2017. I thought this past season was his career high, but it wasn't. Still, very productive season. You look at some of his notable games that he did well in: 14 points in Week 17 against Atlanta, had 13 against the Giants in Week 8, had 13 against the Bears in Week 5. Did really well, and actually, also 16 points against the Panthers in Week 10. Now, I think he's another kicker you're going to want to look into, because I think, again, the Bucs are going to be a top 10 offense. They're going to be even better with Brady, with everybody coming back, and literally everybody is coming back. Leonard Fournette, Antonio Brown, they're both re-signed. They're coming back. Ronald Jones is still going to be there. You got Mike Evans. You got Chris Godwin. And also Gronk is coming back as well. O.J. Howard's going to be coming back from his ACL injury. And you have Cameron Brate there as well. So a lot of weapons there, and a lot of points are going to be scored. So Ryan Succop is going to benefit from that. The Bucs are going to be a team that's going to move the ball up and down the field. And also, let's not forget the Bucs Brady had great protection in the playoffs too. And I think that's going to translate over the course of the full season. Now that you're going to have training camp, you're going to have preseasons. There's COVID's kind of going to become a thing of the past. So we're going to start to see more of a return to normalcy. And because of that, the Bucs are going to be really good. They're going to be even better than they were in 2020. And because of that, Ryan Succop, he is going to benefit greatly from that. So I'm going to say he's another top kicker going into the 2021 NFL season. Another kicker that I think is going to benefit from having a top 10 offense, and I talked about them in the last segment, is the Dallas Cowboys kicker, Greg Zuerlein, he'll be entering his 10th season in the NFL, was a 6th-round pick back in the 2012 NFL Draft by the Rams, and had a really good season for fantasy, not his career high. His career high of points was 170 back in 2017. Had 141 points in 2020 for the Cowboys in 16 games. And, yeah, was productive. Looking at some of his notable games, 15 points against the Giants in Week 17. 13 points in Week 16 against Philadelphia. Had 14 points in Week 14 against the Bengals. Had 13 points against the Steelers in Week 9. Had 13 points against the Giants in Week 5. Had 10 points against the Falcons in Week 2. So, really productive. And he's a guy, I think in terms of the length of kicks, the longest kicks that he can make, I think it's going to start declining a little bit. But, and looking at his accuracy too, he made 34 out of 41 kicks, and was 33 of 36 on extra point attempts. The longest kick he made was 59 yards. So, he still's got the leg for it. I'm worried, in terms of the age, he's getting up there in years now. So I'm worried about that. But, he's a productive kicker. Cowboys are going to be scoring a lot of points this year, even if it's in garbage time, So I think that, Greg Zuerlein is going to benefit from that. And he's another kicker that I have on this list that you're going to want to draft for if he falls to you in your fantasy leagues. And, of course, kickers are, typically, you take them late in the draft. I mean, those are like one of the last couple picks you're going to want to make because you want to spend really the whole draft kind of building up your team. And, kickers kind of like not a priority until you get later into your draft. So, next kicker on this list, I got Mason Crosby. This past season in 2020, 115 points in 2020, played in all 16 games, was 16 of 16 for field goal tries, was 59 of 63 for extra point attempts. So he is still very accurate. Did have kind of a rough season back in 2018, especially that Lions game where he missed pretty much every kick, and that was a disaster. And it looked like that might have been the end of Mason Crosby, but it wasn't. The Packers, I think, are going to be a team that's going to score a lot of points again. I know I talked about how Aaron Rodgers' production might drop a little bit, but I think the Packers are still going to be a top 10 offense. The only thing is Mason Crosby did only reach double-digit points in fantasy 4 times in 2020, so that's a little concerning, but that's also the fact that the Packers really were just cashing in on touchdowns, really making Mason Crosby's job a lot easier, not having to worry about kicking field goals. He only had to kick extra points because the Packers were so good in the red zone last season. The longest kick that he made in 2020 was a 59-yarder. So, that's still got the leg, So, and then same thing that goes with Zuerlein. So, Packers going to be a top 10 offense. Mason Crosby is going to benefit from that greatly. And, I think that Mason Crosby is, still a valuable kicker. And I know that, like I said, he only scored, double-digit points in 4 weeks. But I think that, basically every game, he's going to get points, because the Packers, they're a team that is going to constantly be in the red zone, going to be moving the ball down the field because of how good they are. Mason Crosby is going to be a top kicker going into 2021. All right, so the next kicker I have on this list is the kicker for the San Francisco 49ers, Robbie Gould, will be entering his 17th season in the NFL. That's pretty remarkable. He's coming off of a season where didn't reach 100 points, and I think that had a lot to do with the fact that the 49ers offense was pretty inconsistent, I'll put it lightly. This past season in 2020, having guys like Jimmy Garoppolo, George Kittle, Deebo Samuel, Brandon Ayuk, and Raheem Mostert, and Tevin Coleman as well. Guys were constantly in and out of the lineup, and the 49ers offense really suffered in 2020 because of the amount of injuries that they had. I think that has a lot to do with why Robbie Gould did not have, the productive season that, he's had, because he has been one of those really consistent kickers, and I will admit that he was the guy that I chose, that I drafted before the 2020 season to be my kicker because I thought the 49ers offense was going to be amazing and, really was not. And, he did have his career high in fantasy points back in 2017 for the Niners, and that was before they got Garoppolo. Well, they did get Garoppolo during the year, and then he finally played. But then, his numbers have kind of declined each of the last 4 seasons from that 153 down to 130 in 2018, 110 in 2019, and then 97 in 2020. So it's a little concerning that his numbers have kind of declined, but again, I think that has a lot to do with the fact that, you had a lot of guys on their team in and out of the lineup. And you know what? It's going to be interesting to see what the 49ers do, on draft night. Are they going to change quarterbacks? What is their strategy? Who are they going to take? I don't know. Will that impact, how the 49ers offense is going to be? Absolutely it is, because, they're going to have a new quarterback most likely, and it seems like they might be trading Garoppolo. So, we'll see what happens with that, but I think regardless, I think everybody on the Niners offense will be healthier than they were in 2020, and because of that, I think Robbie Gould is going to be a top kicker in 2021. So the next kicker I have is Justin Tucker, coming off of a season where he had 136 fantasy points, averaged 8.5 fantasy points per game, was 52 of 53 for extra points in 2020, and was 26 of 29. He had an 89 field goal percentage in terms of regular field goals, so he was still accurate. Still going, man. 10th season in the NFL he'll be entering when we get to the 2021 season. His longest field goal that he made was 55 yards in 2020. So looking at some of his notable performances, you had Week 2 against the Texans, he had 15. Week 6 against the Eagles, he had 14 points. 10 points against the Titans in Week 11. 10 points against Dallas in Week 13. So again, another kicker that only reached double digits 4 times. So that is a little concerning, but I think with the Ravens offense, they're one of the top offenses in the league, and I think they're going to continue to produce. I think Lamar Jackson, I want Lamar to, develop more as a passer. The Ravens, they're going to run the ball. I mean, I think that's kind of their identity, is they're going to run the ball. Hopefully, for their sake, they address the wide receiver spot in the draft, because they definitely need that. They got good tight ends, but I think they're a team that needs a wide receiver. And because of that, I think if they have a good draft, they draft some receivers, they get guys in there that can produce at the receiver spot. Lamar Jackson continues to progress as a passer. They keep running the football. Justin Tucker is going to get some opportunities. And because of that, I have him as another kicker on this list. So another kicker on this list, besides Justin Tucker, is Harrison Butker for the Kansas City Chiefs. Will be entering his 5th season in the NFL, and had another productive season. The longest kick that he made was from 58 yards, and I believe that was the kick against the Chargers in Week 2 to win it, and it was that kick in that game. And that was an amazing game. That was when the Chiefs were losing, and that was Justin Herbert's first start. And that was a game that went into overtime. And Butker, again, was productive. Had 131 fantasy points, was 48 of 54 for extra points, was 25 of 27 on regular field goals, which makes that out to a 92 field goal percentage, which is really good. Guy, for the most part, makes all of his kicks. And, in terms of field goals, was 100% pretty much every game except for against the Panthers, where he did miss one, but was 100% in terms of field goals. In terms of extra points, was very accurate, did miss a couple extra points during the season, but overall, one of the most productive kickers. And, when you're a kicker for the Kansas City Chiefs, you're going to get a lot of opportunities, and he's definitely going to be is going to have another productive season, and is going to be another top kicker going into 2021. Then I got Will Lutz as well. I think one of the things that I'm kind of concerned about is, how is the Saints offense going to be going into 2021? There are a lot of question marks there. But I think Will Lutz is still a very productive kicker. did kind of take a little bit of a step back in 2020. Was 23 of 28 with field goals. It had an 82 field goal percentage, which was the lowest of his career. Well, actually, he had an 82.4 in 2016, had an 82.1 in 2020, so that would make it the lowest of his career. The longest field goal that he made was 50 from 53 yards. In terms of extra points, he was 57 of 58. He averaged 8 points per game, had 128 fantasy points. That was the lowest of his career. Some of the notable games that he did good in, Week 10, not Week 10. In Week 1 against the Bucs, he had 10 points. In Week 3 against Green Bay, had 12. Had 14 against the Chargers in Week 5. Had 14 against the Bears in Week 8. And the Chargers and Bears games were both in overtime. Those were both overtime wins for the Saints. So, again, another kicker. Well, actually, no. He had 5 games where he had double digits. So, again, the one concern that I have with him is that, I don't know how the Saints offense is going to be. It's going to look very different in 2021 because of, the quarterback change from Jameis Winston now going to, from Drew Brees now going to be Jameis Winston. And who knows, maybe Taysom Hill's going to start. I don't know. So that's the one thing that concerns me. But I think overall, Will Lutz, I think he's going to have a better season. And because of that, he's another kicker that I have on this list. And then the final 2 kickers here, I got Graham Gano for the New York Giants. This was one of his most productive seasons, in fantasy. I think at one point, really, I kept saying he was like the Giants' best offensive player because, Saquon was hurt. Daniel Jones was not really doing that good. Darius Slayton was inconsistent. Evan Ingram, kept dropping the ball. And, really, the Giants' offense was not, that great last season. It got better as the season went on. But, all throughout that, Graham Gano was so consistent, was always making field goals, really was great. And if you look at his numbers in 2020, as we go right through them, so he was 31 of 32 with field goals, so he had a 96.9 field goal percentage. The longest field goal he made was 55 yards and was 21 of 23 for extra points, averaged 7.8 points per game, had 124 total points, and had 20 points against the Cowboys in Week 5. He had 11 points in Week number 3 against the 49ers, and that was the game where the Giants couldn't do anything against the 49ers backups. That was a pretty pathetic performance. Had 11 points against the Washington football team in Week 9. Had 13 points against the Bengals in Week 12, and that was a big game because, Daniel Jones got hurt in that game, and the Giants really didn't do that well offensively in that game as they should have because it was the Bengals. The Bengals are not a good team. So Graham Gano was pretty consistent overall, was very reliable, didn't miss a lot of field goals as I went through his stats, was 100% in a lot of these games, from when he had to kick field goals. The only time he didn't make a field goal when it came to field goal attempts was against the Bears. He did miss one. I think it was right before the half, and then actually played a huge role in the game because the Giants ended up losing that game. I think by what did they lose it by? I think they lost, 17-13, I want to say the game was. And, if Graham Gano makes that kick, they're only down by 1, and then he kicks another field goal to win the game as time expires. So, that was a big missed opportunity in that game. But overall, very productive kicker. 20 points against Dallas was very impressive. The Giants put up a lot of points in that game because Dallas's defense really, wasn't that good last year. But I expect Graham Gano to have another productive season. This was a guy the Giants were trying to get a couple years ago, and then he re-signed with the Panthers. But now the Giants have him, and as a Giant fan, I am really happy we have him. And then finally, we got Matthew Prater for the Arizona Cardinals. He was with the Lions since 2014. Now he's going to be the kicker for the Arizona Cardinals, and I think he's going to have a good season in 2021 because I think the Cardinals will be a top 10 offense. Kyler Murray is going to be healthy. He's not going to be banged up. I think DeAndre Hopkins is going to have a much better season. I said that earlier in the show. So I think with the combination of all that, and I just think the Cardinals are going to move the ball a lot. They're going to have a good offense. Prater has one of the best legs in the league. I think because of that, he's going to be productive this season, and I think he's going to be one of the top kickers. I really do. So, yeah, those are my top 10 kickers going into the 2021 NFL season. So with that, we're going to take another quick break. When we come back, we are going to do another edition of Draft or Pass, and this time I will be doing tight ends. I'll be taking 10 tight ends, 10 obscure tight ends, and I will be determining whether or not I will draft them or I will pass on them, just like I did in the previous 3 times that I did it when I did quarterbacks, running backs, and wide receivers. Now I will be doing tight ends. So with that, we'll take a quick break, so stick around. We will be right back here on the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. We'll be right back.
Are you looking to get your college football fix? Looking to get the latest news on your favorite school's team? The GSMC College Football Podcast is your ticket to all things college football. Join us as we talk college football from the national championship, the college rivalries, the bowl game, to the Heisman Trophy. To which conference is the best? We've got you covered for the Big Ten, SEC, Big 12, the Pac-12, ACC, and everything in between. Download the GSMC College Football Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
All right, and we're back here on the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast for the final segment of today's show. We're going to do another installment of Draft or Pass, and this is the tight end edition, so let's get right into it. So, with the first tight end I got is Zach Ertz, who is right now still on the Philadelphia Eagles, and he's coming off of a season where he only played in 10 games, well, he started in 10 games, played in 11 games, only had 335 receiving yards, 1 touchdown, and only had 41 total points, and he averaged 3.8 points per game. And yeah, wasn't very good, wasn't healthy, really did not expect him to have the season that he had. I thought he was going to be a star once again, but he really just did not produce at the level that I thought he was going to. Now, when it comes to drafting him, I think as of right now, I'm going to pass on Zach Ertz. There's a lot of uncertainty with him. He might end up on a new team. Who knows? If he stays with Philadelphia, I don't really know what he's going to do. I mean, I think people are still going to draft him, but I think for me, I'm probably going to stay away from him because there was a lot of uncertainty surrounding him, and who knows where he's going to end up. So I'd probably pass on Zach Ertz when it comes to fantasy. All right, so the next tight end I have here is Irv Smith Jr., who is the tight end for the Minnesota Vikings. I think he is somebody that you can draft. I think because of Kyle Rudolph leaving this offseason, I think that's going to open up the door for more targets for Irv Smith. He had a couple good games in 2020. Week 16 against the Saints, he had 17 points. He had 2 touchdowns in that game. He had a touchdown against Tampa Bay in Week 14. He had 12 points there. But like I said, I think now that Kyle Rudolph is now out of the picture and now is a New York Giant, I think that's going to open up the door for more opportunities for Irv Smith. Now, he's kind of considered a touchdown-dependent tight end option, but I think he's going to be productive because now, Kyle Rudolph is no longer there and he's going to have a bigger role on this team. He only had 68 fantasy points. He's going to be entering his 3rd season in the NFL, but like I said, I think now that Kyle Rudolph is not there anymore, I think he's going to have a pretty productive season. Hopefully, he's not touchdown dependent as, many people would say he is, because that is kind of why, some of his stats are a little bit inflated because of the touchdowns that he got in these games. But like I said, I think he's going to be a tight end that you're going to want to get. I mean, he's probably somebody you're going to get in the later rounds. I think he could be, like your second tight end. But you know what? I think he has the potential to be a productive tight end, and, maybe somebody you want to pick up off the waiver wire. So Irv Smith, another tight end on this list. All right, so next on this list, I have Hayden Hurst, who is the tight end for the Atlanta Falcons, coming off of probably his best season in the NFL, where he had 571 yards, receiving 6 touchdowns, had 93 fantasy points. In terms of standard leagues, how I always go by it, was kind of inconsistent a lot during the year, did have a couple good games, but, really didn't, produce like I thought he was going to. And, considering that, he's part of an offense that has Matt Ryan throwing the football, you got Julio Jones, you got Calvin Ridley, I thought he was going to do a little bit more, because he was kind of the odd man out in terms of the Ravens tight ends. They had Mark Andrews there, and Nick Boyle, and Hayden Hurst was kind of the odd man out. I thought, going to Atlanta, he was going to take on a much bigger role, and he really didn't do that. And like I said, really didn't live up to the expectations that I thought he was going to have, especially, like I said, in this offense that consists of all these weapons. Atlanta really, the running game was kind of on and off, with Todd Gurley, but yeah, I really, Hayden Hurst was kind of disappointing. So would I draft him or would I pass on him? Probably would pass on him, just because, also Atlanta, they might be going in a different direction with quarterback. So, there's some question marks there. I think Matt Ryan is going to be productive still. And, Hayden Hurst probably will get, some targets, but overall, I think he's kind of a tight end you're going to want to stay away from. Maybe, if he produces, you pick him up off the waiver wire later on in the draft, something like that. But overall, I think you kind of, you stay away from Hayden Hurst when it comes to fantasy. All right, so next on this list, I have the new tight end for the Los Angeles Chargers, and that is Jared Cook. He's 34 years old, going to be entering his 13th season in the NFL, was tight end 17, had 7 touchdowns in 2020, had 504 receiving yards. He was kind of a disappointment in 2020. He was a guy that I picked up, off the waiver wire, and there was a couple of times where he had 0 points and did absolutely nothing. So he was kind of a disappointment. I think with the Chargers now, I think he's going to be somebody that you're going to want to draft. Now, I don't think he's a tight end 1 anymore. I think he's kind of more of somebody that, you're going to want to keep on your bench and kind of, be a bench player and put him in whenever your tight end decides to, well, not decides, but whenever, your tight end may have a bye week or an injury or something. But, I just don't trust Jared Cook as much as I did, when he was on the Raiders and when he was on the Packers. He's not the same tight end that he was. So I think he's still. That being said, I think that you could still draft him. I think that especially now, going into an offense with Justin Herbert as the quarterback, and you got a bunch of weapons surrounding him. With Eckler and Keenan Allen and Mike Williams. I think that Jared Cook is going to benefit from that. And, Jared Cook did have some good games, though, I will say, in 2020. He did have, 11 points against the Chargers. In Week 5, he had 11 points against the Bears. He had 10 points against the Panthers. But you know what? Again, that has a lot to do with the fact that he is touchdown dependent. I will say he's very touchdown dependent. But I think he has the potential to be really be productive in this offense, especially, like I said, with all the weapons that they have. He did have 90 points. Definitely declined a little bit in terms of productivity when it comes to fantasy. But you know what? I think now Justin Herbert is a young quarterback, and he's got a veteran guy coming in. I think Jared Cook is going to be a red zone target, and I think Justin Herbert is going to benefit from that. So I would draft Jared Cook, but definitely later on in your drafts, he's a guy that you're going to want to get, like I said, towards the end of the draft, and quite possibly could be a waiver wire pickup. So yeah, Jared Cook, another tight end on this list. All right, next on this list, I have the tight end for the Pittsburgh Steelers, Eric Ebron, coming off of a season where he had 558 receiving yards, 5 touchdowns, had 85 fantasy points, which was the second highest in his career. He had 156. That's his career high back in 2018 for the Colts. So, pretty much a big dip in terms of productivity when it comes to fantasy. But he did have a couple good games for the Steelers in 2020. He had 10 points against the Ravens. He had a touchdown there. He had 11 points against the Texans, where he had a touchdown. Had 10 points in Week 16. He had a touchdown there. So kind of really looking at his numbers, really wasn't that successful. He was very touchdown dependent, but he was somebody the Steelers needed. Because the Steelers did lose a lot of weapons. Antonio Brown left, Le'Veon Bell was no longer there. And you had guys like Martavis Bryant. Always being suspended. And Vance McDonald's been very inconsistent at the tight end spot, and he recently retired. So the Steelers were trying to get some weapons back. With Ben Roethlisberger coming back from that elbow injury. So, Eric Ebron, very touchdown dependent. And I know a lot of people were very high on him going into fantasy because, now being in the Steelers offense with Ben Roethlisberger, was Ebron going to benefit from that? And, really didn't deliver. And I think because of that, I would probably pass on Eric Ebron because I just think, again, another guy that's very touchdown dependent. Now, he is somebody that, you could definitely get in the later rounds and pick up off the waiver wire. But overall, I think that, you should probably, avoid taking him because we don't really know what the Steelers offense is going to look like in 2021 because, they don't have a running back right now. Now, they could address that in the draft, coming up. So that could change things. And, I just want to throw something in there. I'm going to be covering I'm going to be doing some segments for the next show regarding what happens in the draft coming up tomorrow. And so back to what I was saying. So depending on what the Steelers do in the draft, I'm assuming they're going to address the running back spot. I mean, they have to. They do not have a running back right now. I mean, I guess you can consider Jalen Samuels, but outside of that, who do they have? Benny Snell? I don't think he's going to be the running back. So yeah, we don't really know what's going on with the Steelers at the running back spot. The offensive line. A lot of guys retired and left in free agency, so that's going to be different, and Ben's getting older, so, with all that, I mean, I just think that Eric Ebron's kind of somebody that maybe you're going to want to just not, stay away from, when it comes to fantasy. But you know what, he can definitely be somebody that could ride your bench, especially in deeper leagues, if you're doing like a 16-person league. So, yeah, Eric Ebron, another tight end that maybe you're probably going to want to pass on. Well, at least I'm going to pass on going into 2021. So, the next tight end I have on this list is the tight end for the Bears, Cole Kmet, who will be entering his second season in the NFL, is 22 years old, and, really didn't do anything in 2020. The Bears just were kind of a very inconsistent offense. And just there really wasn't. Who was the leading tight end? I mean, it was Jimmy Graham, but now he's no longer there. So it looks like Cole Kmet's going to be that guy that's going to take on the role as the number one tight end. Now, for me, right off the bat, I'm going to say I'm going to pass on him just because I think that we don't know what I almost said the Bengals because of Andy Dalton, but we don't know what the Bears offense is going to look like. I mean, the Bears are a disaster right now. They do have a couple good players on the offensive side of the ball. They got David Montgomery, who had a breakout season in 2020. They have Allen Robinson, but I just think that, there's a lot of question marks there. And I just think that with the Bears, I guess David Montgomery's probably like one of the few guys from the Bears that you would take, but outside of that, I'm really kind of staying away from anybody that's on the Bears because the Bears right now, like I said, are a disaster. I mean, we don't really know what they're going to do. I mean, are they going to trade up and maybe try to get a QB? Who knows? I don't know. We're going to find out tomorrow, and if not tomorrow, then we're going to find out, Friday and Saturday. So, it's going to be interesting to see. But, yeah, with Cole Kmet, I think he's a tight end you probably want to stay away from. He's somebody you could definitely get in the later rounds, again, especially with, the bigger leagues that you might be playing in. And also, maybe he could surprise all of us and be a great waiver wire pickup, but other than that, I think you stay away from Cole Kmet. He's a pass for me. And up next is another tight end, well, one of the tight ends that the Patriots got in the offseason, and that is the former Chargers tight end, Hunter Henry. He was tight end 12 in 2020. Will be entering his 6th season in the NFL. Had 4 touchdowns in 2020. That was 15th among tight ends. Had 613 receiving yards. And, he was okay. He was all right. Some of his better games, 12 points in Week 15 against the Raiders. He had, let me see here, he had 10 points against the Jets in Week 11. He had 9 points against the Dolphins in Week 10. So, again, another guy that's kind of touchdown dependent. And also in Week 5 against New Orleans, he had 8.3 points and a touchdown in that game. So, yeah, a guy that's kind of touchdown dependent. And that's kind of like the reoccurring theme with a lot of these tight ends. So, with Hunter Henry, I think he's a guy that, I think you do draft him, but I don't think you draft him as your number one tight end. I think Jonnu Smith is probably going to be the number one tight end. The Patriots love to use their tight ends, with the 2 tight end sets back in the day with Gronk and Scott Chandler back in 2015. So, and also Gronk and Martellus Bennett. So, the Patriots do love to use their tight ends, and I think that's something that's definitely going to continue in 2021, considering that the Patriots tight end spot, is pretty lackluster, to say the least, and so I'd probably draft Hunter Henry, but I would draft him, in the later rounds and be kind of like my backup tight end in case if my tight end gets injured or he's on a bye week, and maybe if he doesn't get picked up or doesn't get drafted, then he could be a waiver wire pickup late in the season. So yeah, I would draft Hunter Henry. All right, so the next tight end I have on this list is the tight end for the Denver Broncos. Noah Fant will be entering his 3rd season in the NFL. Was a first-round pick back in the 2019 NFL draft by the Denver Broncos. Was tight end 10 this past season in 2020. Played in 15 games, had 673 receiving yards and 3 touchdowns. Averaged 10.9 yards per reception, had 87 points in 2020. Some of his best games really came in the first 2 weeks of the season. Had 14 points against the Titans and had 13 against the Steelers. Had 2 touchdowns in that game. Had 12 points against the Bills in Week 15. Had only 1 touchdown in that game. So again, another guy that's kind of touchdown dependent. I would probably draft him just because I think there's upside with him. I mean, I think at some point he's going to break out. I think he hasn't lived up to the tight end 1 status that, many people, I think, thought he was going to be, especially going into 2020. Everybody thought the Broncos offense was going to be one of the better offenses in the league, and it really didn't pan out like that. Drew Lock really hasn't panned out. So I think you kind of give Noah Fant, 1 more year to kind of prove that he's a number 1 tight end. And also, again, because the tight end spot can be very thin, he's a guy that I think you should draft. So Noah Fant, another tight end on this list. So the next tight end I have on this list is the tight end for the Dallas Cowboys, Blake Jarwin. He only really didn't play in 1 game. He tore his ACL back in Week 1 against the Rams. And, yeah, so only had 1.2 points. But if you look at the previous season, he had 54 points in 2019, had 365 yards in that game, had 3 touchdowns. He's kind of like the forgotten man in this offense because they have so many weapons. But you know what? For some reason, he always did good against the Giants, no matter what. I mean, he broke out against the Giants. He would always score a touchdown whenever he was playing the Giants. I mean, he had 3 touchdowns in 2018, and those all came against the Giants in Week 17. Now, when it comes to draft or pass, I would probably pass on him just because he's coming back from a major injury. And I just think he's kind of the forgotten man in the offense. So, yeah, probably would pass on Blake Jarwin when it comes to fantasy. I mean, he's a guy you could probably get maybe later on in the year if he's, producing. But, yeah, Blake Jarwin, probably stay away from him in fantasy. All right, so the final tight end that I have here for tonight's show is Rob Gronkowski. Now, Gronk, he retired for a couple of years. It didn't look like he was coming back, and it seems like he faked his retirement, to because it looked like he was going to be, he was supposedly going to be traded to the Lions, and that was kind of one of the reasons why he kind of retired, and then he came back after missing, not missing, but kind of taking a break. But then once Brady went to Tampa, Gronk was like, let's go. Really wasn't that productive as opposed to what he has been in years past. Only had 682 receiving yards, 3 touchdowns, had 104 fantasy points. So he did have a couple of good games. He had 13 points against Green Bay. He had 12 against the Raiders. He had 10 against the Giants. He had another 10 against the Chiefs. So he had 17 against the Lions. He had 2 touchdowns there. So, yeah, that was a team he was supposed to go to, supposedly. So would I draft or pass on Gronk? I'd probably draft him. I wouldn't draft him to be a number 1 tight end because, I just think that he's kind of, he's not the same tight end he was, even though he's tight end 8. He was productive in some games. I think he's kind of somebody that you would get. I think he's going to get drafted as opposed to, last season when everybody kind of was kind of skeptical on him. But I think he's still draft worthy. I think in the later rounds you would probably draft him. I don't think he's somebody that's going to produce like he did, back when he was with the Patriots. So I would draft Gronk. But again, probably somebody you would get in the later rounds as opposed to, when he was on the Patriots and, he was amazing. He was one of the best tight ends in the league and, one of the most reliable fantasy players in the league, really. So, yeah, those are my 10 tight ends for this edition of Draft or Pass. And with that, that is all the time that we have for today's show. I thank you for joining us. Next time we talk, listen, the NFL Draft is coming up. It's going to happen tomorrow as I'm recording this. And, a lot of crazy stuff is going to happen. And next time I do a show, definitely going to talk about, a lot of stuff that with the NFL and kind of relate that to fantasy. It should be a great draft. Really looking forward to it. And yeah, that's all the time we got. So make sure to subscribe to our major social media platforms and write a nice review. We greatly appreciate it. So with that, that's it. So I'm Kenneth Gruenfelder signing off from the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network, saying have a good night, and we will see you next time.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.